It's been a while. First, cheers to you all. What a great job TechBBQ is doing, right? Big round of applause for the TechBBQ team. No, it's okay. You can put your hands together.
And beautiful.
Put your hands together. I mean, I like how green it is.
You want to sit down or you want to sit?
I feel like standing for a moment, but I'm gonna sit with you in a bit. We'll freeform this.
Yeah, no
for those of you who don't know Robin, I'm gonna introduce him, and he is a brilliant mind, tech analyst, top 3 now in the EU. So a lot to share, and I think he'll be able to unpack that. You'll see some of the vision and the banter between him and myself. And I mean, you're welcome to introduce me. I guess you could say all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, you can introduce yourself a lot better than I can, but editor of Grid Daily, came all the way from the US for this, which is amazing.
For this, 35 minutes of intensity.
So how does it feel to be like in your ears right now? Because I've never actually done this silent state.
Do you feel okay? Give us like a thumbs up if you feel okay.
Yeah.
Okay, those who are not giving us a thumbs up, what's going on? Because you got to just come clean.
So maybe they switch the channel. So.
Or one solution is this. This is the solution, the cause and solution to most of life's problems is right there.
This helps.
So my other thought is, one thing is it's a great segue. I don't know if you caught Robin on stage with Chris Sacca, big deal investor. He's moved in the climate space. I in particular enjoy that we're on the forest stage. I thought it was thoughtful that TechBBQ put this together for us. It was a bit of a difficulty coming on with
it's really weird, isn't it?
What is it, like a Wedgwood or some sort of, and that's Arboretum that we have?
Yeah.
But it works.
We're not out of the woods yet.
It's green. Speaking of people who are not out of the woods, Robin, Nicki Minaj.
Nicki Minaj. Who knows Nicki Minaj? The rapper artist. Did anyone else see what she tweeted on Monday? Yeah,
it's pretty nasty.
For those who didn't raise their hands, Nicki Minaj tweeted that her cousin's friend in Trinidad and Tobago got swollen testicles from getting the vaccine against COVID, which is a very, very perfect example of misinformation, which is what we're going to talk about today. And I don't know if everyone knows the difference between misinformation and disinformation. It's very crucial to understand. Jordan, what's the difference?
Certainly, I'm glad you asked. We'll run with Nicki Minaj here. We don't actually know exactly the status of the swollen testicles, but if she meant to misinform you, right, and her intent was to shepherd information to say he has swollen testicles and the cause of that is the vaccine, that's malintent. She's intending to misinform you. Without intent, if it was an error or she was misguided herself, that's misinformation, which is the focus of this talk, which turns out to be, Robin, a much broader problem of people unknowingly, perhaps, unwittingly, maybe negligently sharing something out.
Yep.
But this has gone viral, this situation. It's just hitting the news now.
The White House was forced to respond to it, and Dr. Fauci had to say this is actually not true. It's probably a sexually transmitted disease, and he wanted to sort of hide it.
It did seem like there was swollen balls.
That's the difference between misinformation. Misinformation is there is no intent to harm anyone or to cause political uproar or to steer an election in a certain direction. It's just fake news. It's just something that isn't accurate that's being spread online. That's misinformation. Disinformation is with intent, where a bad actor wants to cause harm to an individual, society, a country, a whole continent, but just with an intent, which usually propaganda is a good example of what disinformation is, because it's always with a purpose, with a goal in mind. So that's very clear difference that we need to sort of put into context before we start discussing it.
Yeah, but inquiring minds want to know. We have to unpack the Nicki Minaj story. So we'll talk about a number of things on this.
Being called Ballsgate on
a stage. Yeah, so in Ballsgate, the swollen testicles. From what I know so far, that is a fact, but the cause of it is unknown. But the offered reason for it was, by Nicki Minaj, was the COVID-19 vaccine. In fact, she herself is not vaccinated. We assume that's a fact. She's saying that, and she offered to her followers, of which there are tens of millions of followers, to leave comments on her post where she would answer medical questions, which has real consequences, right? One obvious consequence, Robin, is probably people might follow her lead and not take the vaccine.
Yep. Not take the vaccine and then get worse problems than swollen testicles. But it shows that she's using a platform, which is also something that we're going to discuss. She's using a big tech platform to spread something that isn't true. And it does cause harm. Even if it's not with intent, which is what disinformation is, it does cause harm. And what we're going to talk about is is that harm that it causes actually something that we need to do something about, that we need to tell our governments to, in any way possible, make big tech responsible, make them more active in moderating content? This is something that we're sort of going to riff on today.
The obvious place to start is Nicki Minaj. I mean, she sounds like she's to blame because she's the one who's spreading this misinformation. I mean, generally, if we'll accept it, that vaccines don't cause swollen testicles, and I think she actually added and developed that claim into infertility, right? Was like the second claim that she made.
Yeah.
Right, or impotence, exactly. Thanks for clarifying that. An important fact, but where is ire pointed? It's not necessarily at Nicki Minaj, it's somewhere else.
Yeah. And of course, disinformation existed way before big tech. Nicki Minaj, if she wouldn't have a Twitter or an Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or whatever, let's say 30, 40 years ago, she would have this crazy story that she made up or heard from someone, and she would spread it. It wouldn't spread as effectively as it would today for obvious reasons, but it also wouldn't cause as much harm because it's in a relatively closed circle.
And when you say spread, you mean the misinformation, not the test. Okay, just
testicles.
to clarify the two. Yeah,
because that could spread too. But the point is, disinformation and misinformation were around before big tech was around, before social media was around, right? So it's very important to keep in mind that false information and fake news isn't necessarily something new or modern.
You don't say.
Around. And disinformation, the word, actually I thought it was way earlier, but apparently only popped up in the 60s and the 70s. It's like a period of course, big a political uproar and then big changes in societies around the world.
Certainly, I mean, definitely, it's an artifact of this sort of Soviet era, American and European consortium and the pitched battle for the minds of humanity, I suppose it would be, and really a pitched propaganda battle on probably both sides. Anyway, that's the genesis of the word. And it certainly falls today, but back to the social media platforms that are out there. I mean, one of them that she used, Nicki Minaj used, was Instagram. Obviously, this is on Facebook and Twitter. Why are they being blamed, Robin, if it's Nicki Minaj's fault that she's the one spreading this misinformation?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's because the big tech companies, I think, we disagree on this, by the way, but we'll get to that in a second. But I don't think they're doing enough. They could be doing a lot more, either through technology or more people, more resources, but they could be doing a lot more to stop the spread of misinformation.
What's an example? What's a specific example in the Nicki Minaj debacle that they could do?
The fact that the tweet is still live, that is still visible, is a problem.
So to delete her tweet and delete her Instagram post on the same.
Not her account, but definitely the tweet itself should have been deleted or not made visible for obvious reasons, because it's not true.
And so the natural next question is, it seems reasonable, and we could debate the other side, but it seems reasonable. Why haven't they actually done that?
I don't know. I haven't asked them. But it's a question that pops up maybe, 10,000 times a day for different reasons. Why is something that is clearly not accurate being left online? Why is it because it's someone with a lot of followers gets censored a bit less speedily than small accounts, than people with not a lot of followers? That kind of thing is this question I think we should be asking the big tech companies every day, all day long.
Yeah, certainly. It does sound like there's a shield. Nuanced in the Nicki Minaj case, that story developed into one that relates to, I believe, her home country, Trinidad and Tobago. They're very slow and blamed for it, for, I guess, wasting time, is out in the news sphere, investigating whether she said it or not, when it was pretty obvious that she posted about the expanded testicle situation of the relative. It seems obvious that they'd be able to take it down. But a lot of legal regimes stand in that way, right? And one obvious one, at least certainly in the U.S., which I'm familiar with, is free speech, part of the First Amendment. There are very similar protections all over the world. It forces these big tech companies, which might not be equipped or even want to, in a position where, they have to play this sort of constitutional God hand of deciding, well, what's opinion, what's fact, and what are some other factors that might weigh into it. Because the attorney in me, yes, I'm an attorney too, would say this. I'd make the argument, certainly, even if it fails, that this is free speech. This is an opinion that she has, and maybe perhaps any colorable thread to pull on to marshal forward does cast some doubt, and maybe you might concede it is possible that one person ever got the COVID-19 vaccine, or one COVID-19, and maybe it wasn't consequential, but correlated, right, just circumstantially, that person had swollen testicles, a day later. And so they could reasonably think that it was cause and effect, maybe foolishly, and still be wrong, but it could still be an opinion, right? So there's this gray area, to use an overused term, that's out there.
You could even take it a step further. You could say we should leave that information online because it opens up the debate, and it's another chance for the experts, the scientists, to say that is not actually possible. You should still get the vaccine. You can argue either way.
And nonetheless, governments are aroused by this, to, no pun intended. Facebook's certainly been drawn and quartered, also no pun intended, in front of Congress stateside. That's certainly been happened here, in the EU. Some of its regulatory bureaus have fined some of these companies for not literally that incident, but other things within that realm. It seems a bit of a blunt instrument, though, Robin, for government to get involved at all. Maybe for advice to those who are in politics or in government bodies, from our standpoint, our vantage point, knowing some intricacies about a few sides of these stories, what advice do we have, if anything, for governments to start to inspect this to see if there's really anything they can do?
Well, not every government is the same, of course, and not every regulatory framework is the same. EU has more than just the number of countries, right? Because you also have the regionals, and so it's very, very complicated. You can't, as a government, act upon big tech to regulate disinformation in any clear path that you can use as a blueprint in other regions and countries, right? So it's always going to be complicated. But what is quite obvious is that the amount of misinformation that's being spread, that's coming online, but also being spread very actively in a viral way, is just increasing. And the amount of moderation that the big tech companies do to counter it will never, ever scale up quickly enough to counter it. So there needs to be a different type of solution. Either.
Well, that's fair for you to say, and it's probably true. And let's just accept it for the sake of argument. But it's also an assumption that they can't scale up. And we'll just get to that in 1 second, because I do want to set aside the regionality and perhaps dialect aspect. We're going to come into that in just a moment in an interesting way. But big tech, they have stepped up to the challenge. They've acquired some companies, right? That looks like they're doing something.
We're looking this up, like Bloomsbury and what are the other names? Like Facebook and Twitter both bought AI companies trying to.
They have names like Dracula and all this. Yeah, they're AI companies. It's a bolus of AI companies. There's other tools like Gawk we're looking at. Josh Diabiak, a friend of mine from the Zebra. Some of these are nascent, right? Or at least maybe a better way to put it is low penetration. Also no pun intended, perhaps. That they're not widely adopted, but they're nonetheless tools. And big tech, for them, it is a well-worn road to acquire companies. So it seems that naturally they would acquire these technologies, given that sheer pressure, the social pressure to do something that maybe unfairly is pinned on them. That's one thing that they can do. But how is that working out so far?
This is sort of where we disagreed earlier when we were prepping for this. Because your argument is small tech companies, because there is a problem, there will always be a company or individual that wants to solve it.
Someone out in this audience might have solved these problems already and is an acquisition target for Facebook or Twitter, which have already acquired in this industry.
Even then, you could, I'm on the other side of the fence. It's not because Facebook and Twitter buys technology to better deal with this that they'll be able to. Maybe they do it just to grow the team in a way that's not adequate or sufficient.
Sounds expensive way to grow a team.
Maybe they do it as a PR stunt. Maybe they do it for different reasons than they publicly disclose, right? So I don't think that's going to solve. I don't think technology in itself, AI or other technologies, is going to solve the problem of disinformation.
Well, I think
at all.
I think it's very probable that you're right, because some of the acquisitions that we just spoke of, Bloomsbury in particular, were now several years ago. Twitter bought had its main acquisition space in 2018. Facebook in 2019. It's been enough time to probably make a dent. And our friend Mark Scott at Politico, we should invoke at this moment, points that out. They have made some inroads, despite the mistrust of social media platforms. They have made some inroads in moderation, but in English, which sounds like a big problem for me, Robin.
And maybe just for context, Mark Scott is a reporter for Politico, specializes in disinformation, is a friend of mine. Because we're not very smart, I'm just
Well,
talking
you're
about-
top 3 now, so you
top
might have
3,
gotten
you're top
demoted
5.
if you were.
We're not very smart, so I reached out to him like an hour before this talk just to ask him like, what are some facts and figures that I can like throw in the audience. The first thing he said was, the amount of misinformation is growing. The
drink
amount of
for this.
technology, have a drink. The amount of technology that goes to counter it, either from big tech or smaller companies, is growing as well because it's a problem and someone wants to solve it. However, what we perceive to be the problem, we always look through our own glasses, which is the English language or our own language or languages. The problem, according to him at least, is a lot bigger in the part of the world where we don't speak the language and where there is a different culture. And that's, of course, the large majority of the population of the planet.
And give us an example to make this as concrete as possible.
Yeah, because it's easy to go up with an example in Malaysia or whatever, but there's an example closer to home. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but in Paris, in the banlieues, which is like the suburbs of the city, at some point, the people, especially the youth, developed their own language. It was called verlan, which is the opposite of the word à l'envers, which means you twist words around. You just reverse them. And it was a way for them to sort of be able to speak amongst themselves without police or social forces sort of to intervene or to understand. Thank you.
So wait a minute, Robin. What you're telling me is French speakers in a specific part of Paris that are in this ring of suburbs, but not necessarily in the middle, created their own language by inverting French words, like every French word. Like
not every, but like the key words, yeah.
And so, for example, femme,
which means woman, would become muff.
The muff.
They just twist the words around. And people in the beginning would not understand what these people were talking about. And of course, you can educate your police force. You can train them, right?
You're assuming that they were trying to escape scrutiny from police, which in a lot of ways would be analogous to your Facebook moderator, perhaps, or Twitter moderator. Even Spotify has this problem, which we'll get to in just a moment.
So
how is that working out? Are they still escaping police's
It's still
detection?
being used, but more as a culture, folklore thing, because it used to exist. It doesn't exist anymore. But my point is, it's not just Eastern languages that we don't know anything about. It's also Western languages. There are differences that you can make to hide the fact that you're sharing information in a certain way. So imagine being a big tech platform, either a Twitter or a Facebook or a TikTok, and having to counter and moderate language that is constantly evolving, language that you may not be familiar with, that you might have to hire a team for. All of these things take time, and technology doesn't solve every problem. So I think eventually policy governments will have to intervene and force big tech companies to do certain things that they might not want to, because simply technology and throwing like a bunch of humans at the problem is not going to solve it.
Well, I think we know when that might happen, and that's when ire is not as much directed at the social media platforms or big tech itself, and that oligopoly, as this panel was framed, but towards governments. It tends to spur their action, certainly, and for the platforms themselves, they stand on both sides of the coin. We just mentioned Spotify, which brings us to our first question. What the hell is going on at Spotify? They have podcasts, right? It's part of their repertoire of what's in their system, the content category. Most of it was music, and now it's podcasts. But some of those podcasts are notorious for spreading misinformation, possibly disinformation too. Dak Shepard's this sort of like armchair medical guy. Joe Rogan is really probably the biggest name, and he's paid a lot of money, which goes to the question of incentives. What are the incentives of big tech to perhaps, pull the wool over our eyes about actually monitoring this antagonistic content effectively, Robin?
Well, that's the other point, right? When we think fake news and disinformation, we automatically think articles, like text-based articles and we were looking up some examples. It's quite insane when you start to look for examples of disinformation, the kind of shit you find online. It's funny to us, but it does get spread and it does cause harm. But it's also audio, right? When we think big tech, we think Facebook, we think Twitter, we think ByteDance with TikTok and whatnot. But it's also audio. And increasingly, platforms like Spotify is buying podcasting platforms all over the place. How do you start moderating different channels, different ways of communication across languages and cultures around the world effectively? I personally don't think it's possible at all. I don't think you will ever have the either technology or resources to do that effectively.
It opens the door to our next question, which is maybe this paradigm of centralized, right? Centralized big tech companies that are then in a position forced to moderate have to act. Maybe they're ill-equipped. Maybe the acquisitions that I offered up of some cool startup here that's out at TechBBQ that specializes in moderation, maybe some AI creature that they've created. Maybe even it goes after niche languages, and maybe even Verlan, the inverted French that we spoke of. Even with all those tools accessible, still have things creeping through, and especially for podcasts, where Spotify certainly has no interest because, well, has less incentives because there's a lot of money behind those that spread, essentially propaganda that's plain wrong. Is there another system? Is there a way to distribute power to the user base or get it away from a centralized moderator? Robin?
I don't think so.
I think that's in the future. And I think our question teases that. If there's any solution that we could conceive of.
If anyone knows anything, let me know, because I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, literally, raise your hand and literally tell us. Oh,
there you
that's
go. Peter!
It's the one who knows.
I don't know how this is going to work. Maybe you can shout at them. Maybe you can repeat the question.
Write it on Slido and spit it. And I'll don't worry. Even
What's
if it's
your
a
name
sentence,
so we know it's yours.
Even if it's a sentence, I'll turn it into a question. Watch that. That's another type of inversion. Where were we? So actually, everyone's going in anonymous. I think Slido is part of the problem, Robin.
Yeah,
because they're
Slido's
anonymous.
the biggest problem.
They could really say anything to us.
Yeah, we should delete
And if I
Slido.
wasn't moderating what they were saying, and you too, they could get us to say anything up here. Actually,
that's right.
Literally, we could
don't
say,
necessarily have to.
We could even offer up opinions couched as facts. Here's an example: how are autocratic systems, and then in parentheses, Russia, China, right? It's an opinion, right, that they're autocratic, Robin? We could debate that point.
I don't think you can debate the point that they're autocratic.
Well, if I was marshaling on the side of the Russian Federation or ROC...
Well, they wouldn't call it that, but they wouldn't pretend to be anything else than they are, I would think. But the question is, how are these systems, Russia, China, filtering information that effectively? I think it's quite because they have a centralized way of information and a way to censor and a way to have that power over big tech companies that none of the other Western countries
maybe they're not. So anecdotally, from I've seen, and I do think
I've run out of beer. I'm really sad.
Well, you need this is that long of a talk, right? It's that good. I'm glad it's refreshing. So back to this situation. Anecdotally, I've actually seen a lot of Russian Federation, especially expats and ex-China. And it depends oftentimes when people leave, so to speak. That effect when they leave that country in particular, they do get off platform, right? They do get off these systems, not just using VPNs, but services like Discord have blown up in popularity, and Telegram. In fact, there's such a proliferation of next iterations of these platforms out there that it makes it very difficult for even these centralized systems, right, to clamp down on it. An even more extreme version is North Korea, which really, in a lot of ways, is able to predate on its population's poverty and sheer inaccessibility to other platforms. Still has leaks, right, which get reported once in a while. The reason that example is so potent is because journalists like yourselves have a lot of difficulty accessing information from those. It's much easier to get information of what's really going on in the Russian Federation or China. So still those leaks are there. They're more effective, but probably that's to the question. It really bears down on what society that the bolus, the population, has chosen to live in, right? By having, frankly, more rights and freedom, you give up the reality of having a centralized system because the power goes somewhere. It's either to the people or more so to the central government of clamping down on that or not.
There's some analogy with a hackers versus security software developers. It's
like an arms
race. A continuous
race.
Battle that will never be won by either side.
Right.
You invent a system that hacks into a certain system. You invent a defense against it, and of course, it incentivizes the other side to just build something else to get in anyway. Misinformation in this is pretty much the same thing. If Facebook implements a way to hide or moderate content in any way, there will be a way around it in some way. Eventually, so it's unstoppable force. It's all constant reaction and action and reaction. Sorry.
Making that point, though, does suggest that it reminds me of my days as a regulator in the U.S. I was a regulatory
Sad
attorney.
days.
What's that?
Sad days, actually.
Sad days. Well, I guess I did my time, right? So there would be, somewhat of an internal saying. It might not actually be said, but there's some amount of fraud that we all tolerate. And so similarly, there's some amount of misinformation that probably internally at these big tech companies that run these platforms are willing to tolerate. And I think that's happening, likely that conversation's happening at the government level too. Well, we can't stop it all, but let's clamp it down, or at least try to identify the worst actors. And ideally, it's a technological solution that
By the way,
that solves that. Yes.
just a second, because I'm going to pull up. We looked up some statistics right before this.
You
Should have
can rattle
memorized them, but I didn't. But it's interesting. So about 2/3 of Americans, it was an American study, 64% say social media has a mostly negative effect on the way things are going in the country. Roughly half of them, 48%, now say the government should take steps to restrict false information. So there is 73% of Americans express little or no confidence in tech companies to prevent the misuse of their platforms. So basically, they know there's a problem. They know that it causes harm, but they don't believe in the ability to either government or the big tech platforms to really do something about it. So it's awareness, but also awareness of the fact that it's unstoppable and it's not solvable.
And speaking of awareness, like clearly these big tech platforms are aware of the spread of information. So here's a potent question. It's a bit Machiavellian, right? And that is, do we want some of the platforms to allow information to infect millions of brains? My interpretation of that is the idea of perhaps feeding the funnel, right? Feeding the silo that some people live in, right? Because you can curate and choose what news you get on most of these platforms, certainly, right? You can follow certain people, certainly listen to some podcasts. Perhaps go with the flow and follow the water, and enable big tech platforms to actually feed certain information to certain groups that are being misled in a counter way. Scary, dangerous, slippery slope. Your take, Robin.
All of the above, I would say. And by the way, sorry, we should have opened with this, but do you remember the statistic that we pulled up first in the notes? Show of hands. Who of you has actively shared disinformation online? Either you shared it and afterwards you found out it wasn't true, or you actively, so someone who admits it.
Who's willing to admit?
New study came out last week. 30% of people who actively seek out accurate information. These are people who are actively conscious about the fact that there's fake news out there and make an effort to find real accurate information. Even they say 1 out of 3 shares disinformation online. Intentionally, probably not, but unintentionally, all of the time. So it's amazing to me how many people are not conscious of the fact that they also are part of the problem. Sorry.
And speaking of part of the problem, we can accept for the sake of argument that Russian Federation is part of it from a very organized standpoint. And let's just accept it for the sake of argument. We can debate that all day, but take it. To what level at that, sort of government to government level should governments be involved? Not necessarily directed at the tech companies, but to other governments that are actively spreading propaganda. Dive in, Robin.
Not my cup of tea. I don't know.
Well, you might not get a visa again after this, what you're about to say.
I don't know enough about it. Should we get to a question from the...
We
only have like 3 minutes left.
We do. I do want to run through this. So Anonymous, which I'm really enjoying this Anonymous
It's always
character.
the same person called Anonymous.
This asks about dividing feeds. I mean, that's interesting, right? Verified or certified information sources versus
That's
those
yours?
that are not. Yeah, so he's identifying himself. Sometimes you don't want to do that. But back to, so actually, I mean, that does happen, right? We know about some of the, Mark Scott wrote of this, some of the moves in that direction, right? In Facebook's news feed, I mean, you might still think it's shit, but there is a verification process for news outlets to get on it. I think Tech.eu is in it. At least Growth Daily is in it. Google News is another one of these syndications. There are these, sort of like good housekeeping. Thank you. These like, good housekeeping sort of like label that we can wear. There are other analogies to that. Are they any good, the ones that do exist, to the question?
I think part of the problem is that you divide information to either verified, certified information versus non-verified. But there's a whole area in between that is information that's not necessarily true, but it's also not completely inaccurate. There's a whole gray area of things that you have to... 1 + 1 is 2. Everyone can agree on that. But if you opine that sometimes some people might get swollen testicles from getting the vaccine, it's very, very difficult for either one of us to say that's not true. We can say it's probably not, and you should still get the vaccine, but we can't say for 100%. So something that it's not true or false. There's like a whole gray area in between that. It's very difficult. And the same goes for news sources itself, right? It's not because you've reported something inaccurately at some point that you should be considered an inaccurate news source for the rest of your lifetime as a publication. You might have just gotten something wrong and corrected it, but how long do you have to live with that stamp, either given by the big tech companies or your audience, right? Companies evolve, opinions evolve, facts evolve, people evolve. So tricky one, I would say, because what you define as accurate information or an accurate source of information might not stay that way, and the other way around. So slippery slope.
And we're almost out of time, Robin.
Sorry,
so
yeah.
I'll leave everyone with this fable. It's the story of the lion, the donkey, and the tiger. The tiger and the donkey were arguing. They said, the grass is blue, says the donkey. It was actually incorrect. Turns out it's green. And the tiger says, no, you're an idiot. Let's go talk to the Lion King and sort this out. I'll tell you you're wrong. So the donkey, breathes. The grass is blue. And the lion says, of course, yes, the grass is blue. And then the donkey turns to the tiger and says, you were wrong this whole time. Breeze off, gallantly enjoying the fact that he felt like he was right, the donkey. And then the tiger is addressed by the lion and says, you're going to be punished with silence for 3 days. The tiger says, why would I be punished? You, lion, know that the grass is green. And the lion says, of course the grass is green. But your punishment is for arguing with an ass and spending any of that time and wasting my time as the lion forum in arguing over something that you know is true with someone who clearly is an idiot. I'll leave you with that note on that question. It's a really good one. Robin, it's been awesome. Love being at TechBBQ.
Yes.
Love this audience.
My first time at TechBBQ.
Love this audience. Until next time, I'm Jordan French, Robin Wauters. Big round of applause for Robin.
If you take anything away from this, it's please stop following Nicki Minaj on Twitter.
Yes.
So, thank you.